Steve Harvey had developed certain routines during his extensive travel schedule for various professional commitments, including selecting restaurants where he could dine with reasonable privacy while still experiencing quality cuisine and service. On an evening in March 2025, during a brief stay in Chicago between taping sessions, he made a reservation at a moderately upscale establishment in a neighborhood known for its diverse culinary offerings rather than its concentration of celebrity visitors. This decision would lead to an encounter that illustrated important principles regarding assumptions based on appearance, the dignity all patrons deserve regardless of recognition, and the professional standards that should govern service industry interactions. Before examining this incident and its implications, viewers who value content exploring themes of respect, professionalism, and appropriate conflict resolution are encouraged to subscribe to this channel and engage through available mechanisms, as such support enables continued production of substantive content addressing important interpersonal and professional dynamics. The restaurant Steve selected was a contemporary American establishment that had received positive reviews for both its innovative menu and its attentive service. The venue attracted a professional clientele that valued quality without the ostentatious atmosphere of establishments catering primarily to wealthy patrons seeking to display their status. Steve arrived at approximately 7 in the evening, accompanied by 2 members of his management team who were coordinating logistics for upcoming production commitments. He was dressed casually in a manner appropriate for an off-duty evening, wearing comfortable slacks and a sweater rather than the formal attire associated with his television appearances. This casual presentation, combined with the fact that he was not in a major entertainment hub like Los Angeles or New York, meant that he moved through the restaurant's entrance without attracting particular attention from other patrons. The host who greeted Steve and his companions consulted the reservation system and appeared momentarily confused, informing them that he could not locate a reservation under the name provided. Steve's assistant explained that the reservation had been made under the production company's corporate account rather than under Steve's personal name, providing the alternative name for verification. The host located the reservation but expressed concern that the party size listed was 2 rather than 3 individuals. Steve's team explained that a third person had been added to the party that afternoon and that they had contacted the restaurant to modify the reservation accordingly. The host consulted with a manager, and after brief discussion, they were informed that accommodating the additional person would require a brief wait while a larger table was prepared, as the restaurant was operating at near capacity for the evening. Steve and his companions agreed to wait in the bar area while the table was readied. They were directed to a small lounge space adjacent to the main dining room, where patrons could order drinks while awaiting tables. The atmosphere in this space was more casual than the formal dining areas, with a combination of high top tables and comfortable seating arrangements. Steve selected a position at one of the high top tables that provided some distance from other waiting patrons, preferring to maintain his privacy and conduct his business discussion without drawing attention. He ordered a drink and engaged in conversation with his companions regarding scheduling matters and upcoming projects, paying little attention to the surrounding environment or other patrons in the waiting area. The waiter assigned to provide service in the bar area that evening was a young man named Derek Mitchell, who was 23 years old and had been employed at the restaurant for approximately 6 months. Derek had grown up in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Chicago and had taken the restaurant position to support himself while pursuing a degree in business administration at a local community college. He worked evening shifts 4 days per week, balancing his employment with his academic schedule. Derek had limited experience in upscale dining establishments prior to this position, having previously worked in fast food and casual dining environments where service standards and clientele expectations differed substantially from those at his current employment. His performance reviews had been mixed, with managers noting that while he demonstrated strong work ethic and reliability, he occasionally struggled with the refined service standards expected in their establishment, particularly regarding his interactions with demanding or difficult patrons. Derek approached Steve's table to take drink orders and to inquire whether the party required any appetizers while waiting for their dining table to be prepared. His demeanor was professional but somewhat perfunctory, suggesting the efficient service approach appropriate for a bar area where patrons were typically waiting briefly rather than settling in for extended periods. He took the drink orders without incident and returned several minutes later with the beverages. As he placed the drinks on the table, another patron in the bar area became involved in a dispute with restaurant staff regarding billing for his drinks. This patron, who appeared to have consumed substantial alcohol, was speaking in a loud and aggressive manner, attracting attention from others in the waiting area and creating an uncomfortable atmosphere. The situation escalated when the intoxicated patron stood up from his seat and began gesturing aggressively toward the bartender, raising his voice further and using profanity. Restaurant management intervened quickly, with the manager who had earlier addressed Steve's reservation issue approaching the disruptive patron and speaking to him in low tones designed to de-escalate the situation. However, the patron's behavior continued to deteriorate, and he made a sudden movement toward the bar that suggested potential physical confrontation. At this moment, Derek, who had been observing the situation with growing anxiety, moved to position himself between the agitated patron and the bar area, apparently attempting to assist in managing the situation, despite this not being his direct responsibility as a server rather than security or management. What occurred next happened with sufficient rapidity that multiple witnesses later provided somewhat varying accounts of the specific sequence of events. The intoxicated patron made an abrupt gesture that Derek interpreted as an aggressive movement toward him or toward other staff members. Derek reacted instinctively, reaching for a glass of water that was sitting on the bar and preparing to throw it toward the patron, apparently intending either to shock the individual into ceasing his aggressive behavior or to create a barrier that would allow staff to retreat from potential physical confrontation. However, in the confusion and rapid movement, Derek's orientation was incorrect. Rather than facing the disruptive patron when he released the water, he had turned partially and was facing in the direction of Steve Harvey's table. The water left Derek's hand and traveled in an arc toward where Steve was seated. Steve, who had been focused on his conversation and only peripherally aware of the disturbance occurring elsewhere in the bar area, looked up just in time to see liquid approaching him. He reacted quickly enough to move slightly, resulting in the water striking his shoulder and upper chest rather than his face. But his sweater was substantially soaked and water had splashed onto the table surface and his companions as well. The immediate aftermath of this incident involved multiple simultaneous reactions. Steve stood up quickly from his seat, his expression reflecting surprise and anger. His companions also rose, one of them moving to position himself between Steve and Derek in a protective stance. Derek stood frozen, his face reflecting shock and horror as he realized what he had done. The intoxicated patron who had precipitated the confrontation was being physically escorted from the premises by security personnel who had arrived during the confusion. Other patrons in the bar area were staring at the scene, some with phones raised to record what was occurring. The restaurant manager who had been dealing with the disruptive patron immediately shifted his attention to Steve's table, approaching rapidly with visible concern. Before the manager could speak, Derek began attempting to apologize, his words tumbling out in a disorganized rush as he tried to explain that he had not intended to throw water at Steve, that he had been trying to manage the disruptive patron, and that the entire incident had been a terrible accident resulting from confusion and poor judgment. Steve listened to this explanation for several moments, his expression revealing that he was working to control his anger and assess the situation rationally rather than simply reacting emotionally to the indignity of having been doused with water in a public setting. The manager attempted to take control of the situation, apologizing profusely to Steve and his party, offering immediate complimentary dry cleaning for Steve's soaked sweater, and indicating that their entire evening's dining experience would be provided without charge as compensation for the unacceptable incident. The manager also turned to Derek, and in a tone that suggested significant consequences would follow, instructed him to return to the kitchen area and await further discussion. Derek's face reflected understanding that his employment was likely in jeopardy, but he remained in place for a moment longer, apparently wanting to ensure that Steve understood the incident had been accidental rather than intentional disrespect. It was at this moment that Derek's expression changed as recognition apparently occurred. He looked at Steve more carefully and stated with evident shock that he had just realized he was speaking to Steve Harvey, that he watched Family Feud regularly with his grandmother, and that he was horrified to have accidentally thrown water at someone he admired. This recognition and Derek's obvious distress created a shift in the dynamics of the situation. Steve, who had been visibly angry moments earlier, appeared to reassess the circumstances based on Derek's evident sincerity and genuine horror at what had occurred. He asked Derek directly whether the water throwing had been intentional or whether Derek had genuinely been attempting to manage the disruptive patron and had simply executed his response poorly. Derek explained in greater detail that he had reacted instinctively to what he perceived as a potential physical threat, that he had intended to throw the water toward the aggressive patron as a distraction or deterrent, and that in the confusion and rapid movement he had become disoriented and had released the water while facing the wrong direction. He acknowledged that his judgment had been extremely poor, that he should not have attempted to physically intervene in a situation that was management and security's responsibility, and that he took full responsibility for the consequences of his actions. Steve listened to this explanation and then asked Derek several questions designed to assess both the truthfulness of his account and his character more generally. He inquired about Derek's background, his educational pursuits, and his reasons for working in the restaurant industry. Derek explained his circumstances, describing his academic goals and his need to support himself financially while pursuing his degree. He acknowledged that his inexperience in upscale dining environments had created challenges in meeting the refined service standards expected in this establishment, but that he had been working diligently to improve his performance and had valued the opportunity to develop professional skills that would serve him in future career endeavors. He expressed understanding that the current incident would likely result in termination of his employment, but stated that regardless of employment consequences, he wanted Steve to understand that the incident had been the result of poor judgment rather than intentional disrespect or malice. The restaurant manager, who had been listening to this exchange, reiterated his apology to Steve and indicated that appropriate disciplinary measures would be implemented to address Derek's unacceptable actions. Steve raised his hand to interrupt the manager and stated that he wanted to discuss the situation privately before any decisions were made regarding Derek's employment. The manager appeared surprised but agreed, directing Steve and his companions to a private dining area where they could speak without the attention of other patrons. Derek was instructed to wait in the kitchen area while the discussion occurred. Steve's companions, who had remained largely silent during the immediate aftermath of the incident, expressed concern about whether Steve was handling the situation appropriately, noting that Derek's actions had been unprofessional regardless of his intentions, and that Steve was not obligated to intervene on behalf of someone who had doused him with water in a public setting. In the private dining area, Steve engaged in a conversation with the restaurant manager that revealed his perspective on the incident and his approach to situations involving mistakes made by young people who were working to build better futures for themselves. Steve acknowledged that Derek's actions had been unprofessional and had resulted from poor judgment regarding appropriate responses to difficult situations. However, he noted that Derek's explanation appeared credible, that his distress and remorse seemed genuine, and that the incident had occurred in the context of Derek attempting to manage a legitimately threatening situation created by an intoxicated and aggressive patron. Steve emphasized that he did not wish Derek to lose his employment over an action that appeared to be the result of inexperience and poor judgment rather than malicious intent or fundamental character flaws. He proposed that the restaurant consider alternative disciplinary measures that would address the seriousness of Derek's actions while preserving his employment and allowing him to learn from the incident. The restaurant manager expressed appreciation for Steve's gracious response, but noted that the establishment maintained strict standards regarding employee conduct, particularly actions that resulted in negative experiences for patrons. He explained that Derek's employment was likely to be terminated not because of the accidental nature of the water throwing, but because of his decision to physically involve himself in managing an aggressive patron, which violated clear protocols requiring that such situations be handled exclusively by management and security personnel. Derek had been trained regarding these protocols, and his violation of them demonstrated either failure to retain important training or willingness to disregard established procedures in favor of his own judgment. Either explanation raised concerns about his suitability for continued employment in an environment where adherence to standards and protocols was essential for maintaining service quality and patron safety. Steve acknowledged the validity of these concerns, but requested that the manager consider the context of Derek's actions more comprehensively. He noted that Derek's attempt to intervene in the situation, while violating protocol, reflected protective instincts and willingness to place himself at potential risk to protect other staff members from an aggressive patron. While this intervention had been inappropriate and had resulted in negative consequences, the underlying motivation suggested positive character traits that should be considered when determining appropriate responses. Steve proposed a compromise that would involve Derek receiving a formal written warning regarding protocol violations and being placed on probationary status with clear expectations regarding future conduct rather than immediate termination. He offered to personally cover any costs associated with the incident, including dry cleaning and compensation for his party's disrupted evening, and indicated that he would not be pursuing any complaints or negative reviews regarding the establishment or its staff. The manager agreed to consider Steve's proposal, though he indicated that final decisions regarding employee discipline would require consultation with ownership. He expressed gratitude for Steve's understanding and generosity in addressing the situation, noting that many patrons would have responded with considerably more anger and would have insisted on immediate termination of the employee responsible. He arranged for Steve and his companions to be seated at their dining table with assurances that the remainder of their evening would receive the establishment's highest service standards. Derek was brought from the kitchen area to the private dining room, where Steve was concluding his conversation with the manager. The visible relief on Derek's face when informed that Steve was not demanding his termination was evident, though he clearly understood that his employment remained in jeopardy pending final management decisions. Steve addressed Derek directly, using the opportunity to provide guidance about professional conduct, appropriate responses to difficult situations, and the importance of understanding and following established protocols in work environments. He emphasized that Derek's instinct to protect others was admirable, but that his execution had been fundamentally flawed, resulting in harm to an innocent patron and violation of his employer's trust. He noted that professional environments require not only good intentions, but also sound judgment about when and how to act on those intentions. He encouraged Derek to view the incident as a learning experience that could inform better decision-making in future situations, and to recognize that accepting responsibility for mistakes while learning from them represented the path to professional growth and development. He also shared his own experiences with making poor decisions early in his career and the ways that learning from those mistakes had shaped his subsequent success. Derek expressed profound gratitude for Steve's intervention on his behalf and for the guidance he had provided. He acknowledged that he had exercised extremely poor judgment and that the incident had taught him important lessons about the difference between good intentions and appropriate actions. He committed to following all protocols precisely in the future and to seeking guidance from management when facing situations where he felt uncertain about proper responses. Following this conversation, Steve returned to his dining table, where he and his companions proceeded with their meal. The service provided during dinner was exceptional, reflecting both the establishment's standard quality and the staff's particular attention to ensuring a positive experience following the earlier incident. Derek did not serve their table directly, as management had assigned another server to ensure no additional awkwardness, but he was observed working attentively in other areas of the dining room throughout the evening. Several days after the incident, the restaurant's management contacted Steve's office to inform him of the final decision regarding Derek's employment. The management had decided to implement the compromise Steve had proposed, placing Derek on formal probation with clear documentation regarding the protocol violations and expectations for future conduct. Derek would be required to complete additional training regarding conflict management and appropriate responses to difficult patron situations, and would be subject to enhanced supervision for a specified probationary period. The management expressed appreciation for Steve's gracious handling of the situation and his willingness to advocate for Derek despite having been the victim of the incident. They noted that Steve's response had impressed staff throughout the establishment and had reinforced their commitment to treating all individuals with dignity while maintaining appropriate professional standards. Derek subsequently contacted Steve's office requesting permission to thank him personally for his intervention. Steve agreed to speak with Derek by phone, during which Derek expressed gratitude not only for the preservation of his employment, but for the guidance Steve had provided regarding professional conduct and learning from mistakes. He shared that the incident had prompted significant reflection about his approach to work and his long-term career development. He indicated that he had become more thoughtful about understanding and following established procedures rather than relying on instinctive responses, and that he had gained appreciation for the wisdom embedded in protocols that might initially seem unnecessarily restrictive. He also shared that his grandmother, with whom he watched Family Feud regularly, had been mortified when he told her about the incident, but had been deeply moved by Steve's compassionate response and had instructed him to learn everything possible from the experience. 3 months following the incident, Derek provided an update to Steve's office regarding his continued employment and development. He had successfully completed his probationary period and had received positive performance evaluations from management. He reported that the additional training he had received regarding conflict management had been valuable not only in his restaurant position, but in other areas of his life as well. He had been promoted to a senior server position with additional responsibilities, reflecting management's confidence in his professional development following the incident. He expressed ongoing gratitude for Steve's intervention and indicated that he frequently shared the story with fellow students in his business courses as an example of leadership, grace under pressure, and the importance of giving people opportunities to learn from mistakes rather than immediately imposing maximum consequences. The incident received some media attention when details became public through social media posts by patrons who had witnessed portions of the event. The narrative that emerged in public discussion focused primarily on Steve Harvey's gracious response to being accidentally doused with water and his advocacy for preserving Derek's employment despite having been the victim of the incident. Commentary praised Steve for demonstrating compassion and recognizing that Derek's poor judgment had occurred in the context of attempting to protect staff from an aggressive patron. Several articles examining the incident noted that Steve's response exemplified the kind of leadership that considers context and motivation rather than simply reacting to outcomes, and that his willingness to use the situation as a teaching opportunity rather than simply demanding consequences reflected maturity and wisdom that transcended typical celebrity behavior. However, some commentary raised concerns about whether Steve's intervention had been appropriate, suggesting that his celebrity status had enabled Derek to avoid consequences that would have befallen an employee who had made similar mistakes affecting a patron without prominent connections. These critics argued that while Steve's intentions had been generous, his intervention had created unfair disparities in how employees were treated based on the identity and influence of the patrons involved in incidents. They noted that service industry workers routinely face termination for less serious infractions when the affected patrons lack the influence to advocate on their behalf, and that Steve's ability to preserve Derek's employment reflected privilege rather than merit-based evaluation. This criticism prompted broader discussion about fairness in employment discipline, the role of influential individuals in advocating for workers who might otherwise lack voice, and the complex intersection of compassion and consistency in workplace consequences. Steve addressed these criticisms during a subsequent media appearance, acknowledging the valid concerns about fairness and consistency while maintaining that his intervention had been appropriate given the specific circumstances. He emphasized that Derek had not engaged in deliberately harmful behavior, but had made a judgment error while attempting to manage a legitimately threatening situation. He noted that employment discipline should consider not only the negative outcome, but also the context, intention, and character of the employee involved. He argued that while consistency in applying standards was important, rigid application of maximum consequences without consideration of individual circumstances reflected inadequate leadership rather than appropriate fairness. He also noted that his intervention had not prevented Derek from experiencing significant consequences, as Derek had received formal discipline, had been placed on probation, and had been required to complete additional training, but had been given an opportunity to learn and improve, rather than simply being discarded following a single mistake. As this account reaches its conclusion, several principles emerge that merit emphasis for readers seeking to understand the significance of what occurred during that March evening in Chicago. Professional mistakes that occur in contexts of good faith attempts to address difficult situations merit different responses than deliberate misconduct or negligence, though this distinction requires careful assessment of circumstances and motivations. Derek's poor judgment in attempting to physically intervene in managing an aggressive patron violated protocols and resulted in negative consequences, but occurred in the context of protective instincts rather than malicious or careless behavior. Appropriate disciplinary responses consider context and character rather than simply imposing maximum consequences based solely on negative outcomes. The capacity to respond to being wronged with grace and consideration for the circumstances facing the person who caused harm reflects emotional maturity and leadership that transcends typical reactions focused primarily on one's own experience and interests. Steve Harvey's decision to advocate for Derek, despite having been the victim of the incident, demonstrated compassion and wisdom that many observers found admirable and instructive. Young professionals benefit substantially from mentorship and guidance following mistakes, particularly when such guidance comes from individuals with extensive experience navigating professional environments and career challenges. Steve's conversation with Derek about professional conduct, judgment, and learning from errors provided value that likely exceeded what Derek would have gained from alternative educational experiences. The intersection of privilege, advocacy, and fairness in employment contexts requires thoughtful examination, as the capacity of influential individuals to intervene on behalf of workers can create both positive outcomes for specific individuals and potential inequities in how similar situations are addressed depending on the identities and connections of the parties involved. Steve's intervention preserved Derek's employment and provided valuable learning opportunities, but also raised legitimate questions about whether similar grace would be extended to employees whose mistakes affected patrons without the influence to advocate on their behalf. These tensions do not admit of simple resolution, but merit ongoing consideration in efforts to create workplace environments that balance accountability with developmental opportunities. Viewers who have engaged with this examination of an unexpected restaurant incident and its implications regarding judgment, consequences, and appropriate responses to mistakes are encouraged to subscribe to this channel for continued access to content exploring professional conduct, leadership, and interpersonal dynamics in various contexts. Individuals are encouraged to consider how they respond when others' mistakes negatively affect them, whether they approach such situations with curiosity about context and circumstances or with immediate demands for maximum consequences, and whether they create opportunities for learning and growth or simply seek to ensure that errors result in appropriate punishment. The thumbnail accompanying this content should feature a perspective road composition utilizing photorealistic artificial intelligence generation with bold text in capital letters, employing white and red accent colors, set within an Australian context that includes visible flag elements and conveying dramatic atmosphere appropriate to the subject matter while maintaining professional presentation standards.